tradition of Memphis Wrestling, a television show that at one time drew mind-boggling numbers in the late 70s through the late 80s on WMC TV, will be returning on 4/18 with the formation of a new company called Memphis Power Pro Wrestling. WMC TV General Manager Mason Granger, who had canceled the show in the wake of the legal problems between the partners and the now defunct United States Wrestling Association, agreed to begin a new show at midnight on Saturday nights. The show will be taped at the WMC studios every Saturday morning, and is also expected to have a repeat showing most Sunday afternoons. The show is planned on being moved back to its traditional time slot of 11 a.m. Saturday mornings on 9/12, at which point it will air live. During the glory days of Memphis Wrestling, the weekly TV show did upwards of a 20 rating and 70 share, making it by far the highest rated wrestling television show in the country and perhaps the world. Randy Hales, the longtime general manager of the USWA before leaving after a falling out with Larry Burtman, is listed at 100% owner of the new company. Hales has mentioned Sid Vicious and Miss Texas, Jacqueline in WCW, as the top stars he's planning on using, and has been mum about the obvious names, Jerry Lawler and Brian Christopher, who were the backbone of the old company. It is believed the remainder of the talent will be the type of wrestlers such as PG-13, Spellbinder, Bill Dundee and the like, which were with the old USWA. Since Lawler is still involved in legal proceedings regarding the end of the old company, which he was part-owner of, his name hasn't been publicly associated with the group, but it is somewhat known he's going to be, along with Hales, the main power in the company, but there will be no on-paper ownership interest in the company. The plan is to start a full-time schedule in May, with the first show taking place on 4/24 in Humboldt, TN, building to the first major show on 6/9 in Memphis at the Mid-South Coliseum called the Homecoming, which apparently will include bringing back some of the major names from the past. The plan would be to run Memphis shows at the Coliseum monthly, as opposed to the traditional weekly, and run a territory that would include parts of Arkansas, Mississippi, Missouri and Tennessee. Since the folding of USWA, its three main cities, Memphis, Louisville and Nashville, seem to have all had a different situation. The main local promotion in Nashville has been Bert Prentice's Bert Prentice Music City Wrestling that runs at the old USWA home, the fairgrounds. Most importantly, Music City gained control of the old USWA television syndication, which gives it a business affiliation with the WWF. Since WWF syndicates Music City as a C-type show and thus gets a small syndicated ratings and number of stations boost to sell its national ads and give the appearance of being closer in overall ratings to WCW. Since Lawler and some Brian Christopher both worked for the WWF, WWF may use the new Memphis territory as a place to send the younger wrestlers, as has under developmental contracts. The traditional Tuesday night Louisville shows were first being run by Mike Samples and Jerry Faith's Kentuckiana Championship Wrestling, which regularly used some ECW talent such as Sabu and Rob Van Dam. But crowds in the 150 range created financial problems. In addition, Ian Rotten, John Williams, continued to promote Ewa's arrival in that market, as he had done when USWA was still in existence. Music City will be taking over the weekly Louisville Gardens dates as of 3/17, leaving only Memphis without a local promotion. Lawler had either been promoting shows on his own, or been in some form behind a promotion without his name on it for legal reasons, every Thursday in Lula, Mississippi, a city not far from Memphis, called Casino Championship Wrestling. A major mini-battle in the midst of the big war is going to take place on 4/27 when WWF has Raw booked in Hampton, VA at the Coliseum, and WCW has Nitro booked the same night in the same metropolitan area at the Norfolk Scope Arena. As anyone who has followed wrestling for any length of time would know, despite frequent protests of both sides not being concerned and this being a coincidence of booking, this is no coincidence. It ended up being a game with both companies moving their on-sale dates forward in an attempt to get the jump, a game won by WWF. which sent Undertaker to Norfolk to do advance work and put tickets on sale on 3/9 and did a strong first day. 4 days ahead of WCW's on sale date where they were sending the Nitro Girls and Harlem Heat to the naval base. This is the first major head-to-head battle since 6/28, when both companies ran the Los Angeles market with major house shows, which, as it turned out, was the same night as the Mike Tyson-Evander Holyfield fight. While WCW outdrew WWF, it paid a heavy price, spending more than $100,000 in advertising on the show, with the show actually running at a loss while the WWF event was profitable. It appears another similar situation is going to take place in July when WCW runs a Thunder event at the Oakland Arena on 7/16 while WWF has a house show booked at the Cow Palace in San Francisco the next night. From time to time, a regular feature in specialized sports magazines would be to examine Hall of Fame credentials of active players. Sports Illustrated did that a few months back with its resident football expert, Paul Zimmerman, talking about current football superstars like Barry Sanders, John Elway, Dan Marino, Jerry Rice, etc., who are sure things, and then doing a few probables, maybe and near misses or too early to tells. We've been doing Hall of Fame issues the past 2 Augusts in these pages. Pro wrestling, being different from shoot sports like baseball or football because those sports are performance-oriented and wrestling has many orientations, performance, entertainment, and money drawing power. The advantage for pro wrestling is that the physical athletic prime of an athlete usually precedes the peak of his drawing power by several years, although there are exceptions. In pro wrestling, there are several stages that can be taken advantage of. The young hot period, the veteran on top period, and even the post-40 George Foreman deal when done correctly, and wrestling has the ability to do all of those levels correctly since it controls the outcomes. Between that, and the fact that it seems that some people never retire, the classic sports waiting 5 years after retirement before consideration just isn't practical. I mean, we'd all be dead before Bob is even eligible and he's already 60. So we've taken either the age of 35 or 15 years as a pro as the criteria for being eligible. Of active wrestlers, promoters, and performers, quite a number have already been listed. Perro Aguayo, Giant Baba, Abdullah the Butcher, Kanig, Negro Casas, Ricky Choshu, Jim Cornette, Ric Flair, Tatsumi Fujinami, Dory Funk Jr., Terry Funk, Stan Hansen, Bret Hart, Bobby Heenan, Hulk Hogan, Antonio Inoki, Toshuki Kata, Jerry Lawler, Devil Masami, Mil Mascaras, Tiger Mask Sayama, Vince McMahon Jr., Mitsuharu Misawa, Chikusa Nagao, Atsushi Onita, Antonio Pena, Roddy Piper, Dusty Rhodes, Road Warriors, El Hijo del Santo, Randy Savage, Nobuhiko Takada, Genichiro Tenryu, Jumbo Tsuruta, Big Ben Vader, and Jaguar Yokota. All Hall of Fames are subjective to begin with, but pro wrestling has to be the hardest because there are no cold facts you can look at like statistics in real sports that are meaningful other than drawing big crowds. And a lot of those depend on correct circumstances rather than showing career-long success. So let's make some quick thoughts on some of the others with their ages and number of years active. Age of 35 or more or 15 or more years active means they should be under consideration for August. Lioness Asuka 34, 18. She almost becomes the Baseball Hall of Fame argument point. Since in her prime she was considered on the same level as Jaguar Yokota, Chikusa Nagao, and Devil Masami, all in, then she should be in as well. Certainly in her prime she was part of the most popular women's tag team ever and maybe ever will be. She was one hell of a worker as well. I can't come up with a stronger argument against her being another than since her return from retirement, she's been a star for small promotions but not really been a big deal, and you'd think a Hall of Famer should always be a big deal. Steve Austin 33, 9. Not yet, but 2 more years like this past one and barring the career-ending injury, and he looks like just for Impact and Stardom alone that he'll be an easy pick. And if he doesn't get the career-ending injury, He's probably made as a superstar for the next 10 years easy. Chris Benoit 30, 13. He's only 30, but just from a working standpoint has to be one of the 2 or 3 greatest junior heavyweights of all time. Never a major draw, but someone with that kind of ability and the caliber of matches he's had for years has to be seriously considered. Eric Bischoff 41, 10. Too soon. The promoters on the list, with the exception of Antonio Pena, who totally revolutionized a business in his country and created more young stars than almost anyone, proved their worth over more than 10-year periods. There are plenty of promoters who have had hot runs. A promoter has to be judged historically on not only the peak but also the length of his run. Sheen Karras 48, 24. Mexico's top heavyweight heel from the mid-70s through the mid-90s. Hey, I think he sucks too. He's a definite superstar in that culture. I'd vote no on this one. Deuce Karras 47, 26. I've been debating this name since the first year. I don't know that he was ever really a big draw. He never got out of his legendary brother's shadow in either the US or Japan. But for his time, he was probably the best heavyweight worker in Mexico and one incredibly underrated mat technician. Masahiro Chono 34, 14, a charismatic superstar. Again, this is one that will be better viewed a few years down the line. Ultimo Dragon 31, 11, one of the greatest, smoothest workers ever. Played a major part in popularizing Lucha Libre in Japan and being a top name in Mexico. He's only 31, so his future will tell the tale, but despite his non-entity role in WCW, he's one to be considered. Certainly his list of championships around the world is unparalleled for whatever that is worth. Masakatsu Funaki, 28, 14. He's only 28, turns 29 this week as a matter of fact. This opinion may be debated by many, but simply because he's a guy who was a surefire pro superstar who literally risked his career to start what is a shoot sport, or as close to a shoot sport as pro wrestling has ever been in this century on a big-time basis, and became one of the great submission artists in the world for real. My feeling is he's in for impact on the business no matter how the rest of his career turns out. The sad reality is that shooting is very demanding physically because of all the injuries, and a fighter's time in the spotlight is limited, particularly one that is doing as many as 10 matches per year. Terry Gordy, 36, 22. It's really a shame because considering how much he'd accomplished before the age of 30 and how much talent he had, you'd have thought he was going to be a sure thing. It just didn't happen. Fuerza Guerrera, 43, 20. A great worker who has been around forever, but I see him as someone who falls just a tad short. Scott Hall, 38, 14. Had a few memorable matches and has been a superstar for the past several years. Charisma without question. What a career turnaround from a guy who was given the mega push like Luger because of his physique, size, and looks, and spent years in this business as a major flop. Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart made him seem like a lot better wrestler than he really ever was, but no question that WWF made him a legitimate superstar. There were guys with less worldwide notoriety and less ability that are in, but at this point I don't see it. Historically, the current WCW run is one of the biggest ever, and while he's not the key reason, he is an important part of the machinery. Hey, and Lee Marshall says he's the best wrestler in history never to have won a world heavyweight title, and that puts him ahead of Johnny Valentine. Gran Hamada, 47, 27, one of the most underrated workers probably that has ever lived. Never quite hit the eras right. In his prime, he was just too small to make it anywhere, although he was a headliner in Mexico. When the size deal changed, he was already well past 40. I bet there are very few wrestlers who have ever lived that were the quality of worker at the age of 47 that Hamada is now, and he's probably held more lighter weight world titles than all but 1 or 2 wrestlers who ever lived. But he was never that kind of superstar you associate with the names on the list. Another interesting debatable choice, Folk Han, 36, 7. My gut says no right now. But 10 years from now, looking back, depending on the future changes in the industry, he may be an important figure stylistically. He also may be a great submission worker who historically won't mean a thing. Even so, as Akira Maeda's main rival for 7 years and probably the best pure submission worker of his era, even though he has no name internationally, he's still worth consideration. Owen Hart, 32, 14. Not yet, but he's accomplished more at this age than his brother did. Hiroshi Hayes, 36, 13. Another interesting debatable name. A great wrestler who not only participated in the Olympics, but also went on to become one of the top 5 workers in the business, and even more important, behind-the-scenes player, and eventually a senator. A major star, but never a headline world champion level star. Left at his peak to go into politics. Was Riki Choshu's assistant booker during one of the hot periods for any promotion in history. Maybe the combination of his in the ring and his behind-the-scenes power makes up for that his career as a wrestling star never quite reached the level it probably should have. Shinya Hashimoto, 32, 14. Just based on his record for headlining more shows that drew more than 60,000 fans than anyone who ever lived makes him a definite. A good worker, excellent when it comes to drama and believability, and with speed that is surprising considering his awful physique. Michael Hayes, 38, 22. That spot on Raw in Dallas brought back a lot of memories. This was the top heat getting heel in the profession some 14 years ago. Never a great worker, but a great talker and part of some legendary business runs, and as much as anyone else deserves credit for popularizing ring entrance music. Still, his career flamed out too young. We always knew in 1984 that the Freebird was never going to one who would age gracefully in this business. Little did we know just how on the mark that was. Curt Hennig, 39, 19, at his peak was one hell of a worker. My feeling is that he was better in the ring than the vast majority, and he was a big star, but never quite reached the top level of stardom. Most of his work in every role since 1991 has done nothing to help his cause. Paul Heyman, 32, 12. Someone to be considered, not as a manager, but as a booker and company owner. He did innovate a lot of ideas that the major companies took and is responsible to a great deal with the current direction of at least the WWF. Still, we've got very few promoters and there are plenty who have had more success. It's a possibility, maybe even a probability 10 years down the line if he accomplishes what many feel he will, but now is way premature. Akira Hakuto, 30, 13, in. Not even debatable. Probably the best woman wrestler ever when it comes to ring psychology, and she was the biggest star on the women's show that drew 42,500 to the Tokyo Dome. Kyoko Inu, 28, 10, an awfully great worker. Maybe it's an aversion to too many women from the same era, so I'm leaning against it. Cactus Jack, 32, 15, not the level of superstar when it comes to drawing power as most of the names in there, but my feeling is when people look back, he's in, just based on all those best brawler awards. Legendary matches and the intangible of just how much heart and being such a unique figure. Kenta Kobushi, 30, 11, barring injury, a sure thing. Aja Kong, 27, 12. An interesting choice. It's almost the argument that since Dump Matsumoto is in, Aja Kong should also be in. Dump got a lot more heat in her heyday even if she wasn't close to the worker Aja was. Aja does deserve a lot of credit for popularizing women's wrestling to male wrestling fans in Japan who shunned it, and she was a headliner during a hot period for a company that drew absolutely amazing gates for a woman's promotion. Jushin Liger, 33, 14. If he never wrestles another match in his life, he's a first ballot sure thing. Liz Mark, 48, 24, one of the real legendary flyers in Mexico, who is still a main event wrestler today after nearly 3 decades in. Lex Luger, 39, 13. Okay, superstar Billy Graham was a big name largely just for his physique, so there is a precedent, and Graham probably wasn't even as good a worker as Luger, although he was more colorful and a better interview to be sure. But Graham paved the way for Hulk Hogan and was, with the possible exception of the Sheik, the single biggest drawing heel in the country during the 70s. Luger doesn't qualify even though he's been given more chances to shine than almost anyone because of that physique. Shawn Michaels, 32, 14, a sure thing. Kichi Muto, 35, 14. I see him as a guy who is being groomed to be an all-time legend, but time will tell where he is in 5 years, and that will tell the tale. A great worker when he had his working shoes on, but not consistent enough to make it just on work alone. A big star, but right on the bubble as far as whether he's a big enough star. My feeling is based on his decline in the ring last year, that this is someone leaning in but that we should reserve judgment. Bull Nakano, 30, 15. She was without question the top woman wrestler in the business between hot years. She was just hitting her stride in the Crush Gals era, and she was on top but fading during the early 90s supercard period. A fantastic worker, and a major name. Always described to me as a female Jumbo Tsuruta, and Tsuruta is no-brainer pick. Thinking about her stardom at her peak, I'd have to give her the nod. Kevin Nash, 39, 8. You can never tell the future, but at this point, not in our lifetime. Blue Panther, 37, 21. Not quite the name, always one step below. One hell of a mat wrestler, like a Mexican version of Dean Malenko, but a much bigger star than Malenko ever was. La Parka, 32, 12. If he had never gone to WCW, I'd say he was on his way. He was going to be the Mexican version of Dusty Rhodes, as a charismatic headliner for more than a decade. The Mexican economy derailed his trip and sent him north to be a jobber. Jake Roberts, 42, 23. Never a great worker, but a great wrestling psychologist who made a huge name in the business from the glory days of the WWF. He was never actually a consistent headliner, but was near the top for years when wrestling had a lot of television exposure and is probably better remembered than most of those who did headline. I don't see it, but his name is so big that it's a name worth debating. Jim Ross, 45, 23, the best announcer of the era. Also Vince McMahon's top assistant during one of the hottest business periods in history. His critics could also bring up he was also a major player behind the scenes when WCW was losing about as much money as any wrestling company in history. My feeling, just for announcing, he belongs in and the rest is just icing. Massasaito 55, 33, since he'll be officially retiring this year, although in reality he's pretty much done as a wrestler, this is a name to think about. Another of those most underrated for life wrestlers. He was a star everywhere he went, generally as part of a Japanese heel tag team, but never a major singles headliner until his big 80s program with Antonio Inoki climaxing in the legendary Jungle Match. Was one of the best workers of his day, and came back after the age of 40 after 2 years in prison to have the greatest success of his career. He reminds me a lot of Dick Murdoch, who is one of those guys right on the bubble, so to speak. Great Sasuke, 28, 9, depends on the future as he's only 28 years old, but his body is probably broken down more than any 28-year-old in the business. If Michinoku Pro Wrestling is around for the long haul, and if he can work it somewhere near his current level for many more years, he probably should be in, if only for starting a cult promotion and keeping it going, and having so many great matches and making himself into a celebrity through excellent self-promotion. Ken Shamrock, 34, 9. On paper, this seems premature, but let's look at credentials. First Pancrase champion, which made him the first champion of a major league shoot, or at least as close to it as has ever been in this century, wrestling promotion. First UFC Super Fight champion, which made him the first total shoot champion. Drew the 2 biggest buy rates in history for shoot matches. Definitely not when it comes to his accomplishments in traditional worked pro wrestling, but without question is going to end up historically as a major figure in the total concept of the pro wrestling world. Davey Boy Smith, 35, 20. A legendary tag team with Dynamite Kid, but I don't see him as a Hall of Fame wrestler. Jimmy Snuka 54-29, someone to really think about. I'm leaning toward putting him in. Popularized high-flying in the United States. Had a real hot run in WWF and was a big star everywhere he went before that time. He could have been one of the 2 or 3 biggest stars of his era, but there are a lot of could-have-beens. But he was a top star for 15 years, who 15 years after his peak is gone, is still remembered for it. Any comments? Steiner Brothers, Rick, 37, 15, Scott 35, 12. We've only got a few tag teams in together. The Deuce X, who popularized tag team wrestling. The Kangaroos, who were the legendary team of the 50s and 60s. And the Road Warriors. Steiners were innovative in their day and superstars in Japan, but never really changed after they hit their stride and in a lot of ways got stale. They were also never headliners on their own and top draws, although they were important near the top of many successful shows. Close, but I don't see it at this point. Sting, 38-13, a guy who has been given plenty of opportunity. I don't know there would be anyone who has earned as much money in the ring or who has been on top nationally in his position for 10 years that isn't in, not to mention with so many major world title wins to his credit, or sold as much merchandise. But for some reason, I wonder how many people would even argue he belongs in, especially after being given one of the great pushes of all time this past year, and a great push so many times, and always falling short of what has been expected of him. Still, he drew more money on one show for his match against Hulk Hogan than any non-WWF match in the history of pro wrestling, and that takes in a lot of ground. Were expectations always too high? Or was he a wrestler who was pushed to the moon but was just missing a very key ingredient to ever leave the planet, even when he spent a year hanging out in space? Akira, 36-11, just don't see it, even though he's been a part of some of the greatest wrestling matches there probably ever have been. I see that as being a lucky person to be in the right place at the right time, and that there are lots of people who in the same situation would have been far better. Manami Toyota 27-11, in. Her match has set new standards not just for women's wrestling, but for pro wrestling. Realistically has to be considered as a pure worker for being the best woman wrestler who has ever lived. Undertaker, 35-12, a good worker for his size, but not a great worker. Basically a guy who lucked into a great gimmick, but made the most of it. He's been a headliner, a top drawing card, and is known worldwide as one of the great wrestling attractions ever. There is a tendency for old-timers to not accept the top stars of today as being equal in importance to those of other eras, but if guys like Dick the Bruiser and Bobo Brazil are in with ease, I can see no argument to keep Undertaker out. Sid Vicious, 38-11, yeah, right. Sure was given a lot of chances, though. Steve Williams, 36-16, had a chance at one point, but my feeling is he doesn't make it. Barry Windham, 37-19, he was the best worker in the United States for a brief period in his prime. Another one who never quite reached the level expected of him, but he was a major star for the entire decade of the 80s and was a better wrestler than the majority of those who are in. Again, another one whose work of late has done nothing but really kill the long-term perception of his career. Larry Zbyszko, 44-26. Hey, had to see if you were still paying attention, or if you actually saw him wrestle in his prime.